Life Stories brings you remarkable tales of resilience, justice, and change. Today, we share the story of Marcus Taylor, a federal prosecutor who turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for systemic reform. What started as a simple courthouse visit to resolve a personal matter quickly revealed the deep biases ingrained in the judicial system. Marcus's courage and determination sparked a movement, inspiring change not just in his community but across the nation. Join us as we dive into this powerful story of standing up for fairness and equality. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey. Life Stories brings you remarkable tales of resilience, justice, and change. Today, we share the story of Marcus Taylor, a federal prosecutor who turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for systemic reform. What started as a simple courthouse visit to resolve a personal matter quickly. The digital clock in Marcus Taylor's car read 8:42 a.m. as he pulled into the parking lot of the municipal courthouse in Jacksonville, Florida. The warm sunlight of the spring morning cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Marcus exhaled deeply, gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. Being late wasn't just an inconvenience for him, it was a rare disruption to the discipline and precision that defined his life as a federal prosecutor. Today, however, the chaos of life had conspired against him. This morning wasn't meant to be complicated. Marcus had come to resolve a mundane issue, an error in the property tax adjustment on his late grandmother's home. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes, and Marcus had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house wasn't just another piece of property to him, it was his childhood sanctuary, the anchor of his formative years. His grandmother, a steadfast and wise woman, had taught him lessons about integrity and perseverance under that roof. It was where he learned to respect others and to stand up for himself. Dressed in a navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Marcus looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was. Yet, this morning had been far from smooth. Just as he was preparing to leave for court, an urgent call had come through about an ongoing human trafficking case. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Marcus couldn't ignore it. Reviewing the motion and coordinating with his team had delayed him, leaving him rushing to the courthouse with barely enough time to spare. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. The judge in Jacksonville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Marcus sighed, sliding the phone into his briefcase. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something about the message lingered, like a faint shadow trailing him. He shook it off and stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The municipal courthouse was a far cry from the imposing federal courts where Marcus spent most of his days. The walls were painted a dull beige, the seats scuffed from years of use, and the faint smell of coffee mixed with old paper lingered in the air. Despite its worn appearance, the courthouse buzzed with energy. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of papers, their faces etched with worry over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Marcus glanced at his watch, 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, weaving through the crowd of anxious faces. Room 204. The brass plaque on the door read, Judge William Harris. Adjusting his tie, Marcus stepped inside. The room was already filling with people, their murmurs blending with the occasional shuffle of papers. He found a seat near the back, flipping open his folder to review his meticulously prepared evidence. The familiar ritual calmed his nerves. The room fell silent as Judge Harris entered, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He carried an air of authority that demanded attention. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure preceded him, and it was evident in the way he scanned the room, his gaze sharp and assessing. All rise, the bailiff announced, and the room shuffled to its feet. Marcus stood tall, his posture straight, watching the judge settle into his seat. Judge Harris began calling cases with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Marcus observed closely, noting the judge's demeanor as he moved through the docket. A middle-aged man in a suit arrived late, slipping quietly into the courtroom unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes entered and took a seat near the front. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Marcus made a mental note but focused on his own case. At 9:15 a.m., his name was finally called. Marcus stood, gathering his folder, and walked toward the podium, his stride calm and deliberate. He projected confidence. But as he approached, he noticed a shift in the room. Judge Harris looked up, his expression hardening, and an almost tangible tension settled over the courtroom. "You're late, Mr. Taylor," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Marcus raised his hand slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." The weight of the room's collective gaze bore down on Marcus. He maintained his composure, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Harris waved a dismissive hand. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words struck like a gavel hitting an anvil, reverberating through the room. Murmurs rippled among the spectators. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Your Honor," he began, his tone calm. "May I explain?" "You may not," the judge interrupted, raising his gavel. "Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Marcus stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness, it was something deeper. Something unspoken yet glaringly obvious. As he returned to his seat, he glanced briefly at the other latecomers. None had been reprimanded. The disparity was clear. Opening his folder, Marcus set aside the property tax documents and began jotting notes. His legal instincts were already at work, assessing the situation with precision. A $750 fine for tardiness in municipal court wasn't just steep, it was punitive. Around him, the atmosphere was charged with unease. People exchanged quiet looks, their discomfort palpable. But no one dared to speak. The courtroom continued its rhythm, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this morning was about more than a simple fine. It was the beginning of something much larger, and he wasn't about to let it end here. Marcus sat in the back row of the courtroom, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and observations. Judge Harris continued calling cases with his usual efficiency. But Marcus couldn't stop replaying what had just happened. The fine, the dismissal of his explanation, and the disparity in how the judge had treated other latecomers, all of it painted a stark picture of bias. As the proceedings dragged on, Marcus discreetly observed the other cases. The man in the grey blazer, who had arrived after the judge, was now presenting his case without so much as a mention of his tardiness. The young woman who had slipped in earlier was seated near the front, scrolling through her phone, untouched by any reprimand. The stark inconsistency weighed heavily on Marcus. He turned to his legal instincts, quickly assessing the situation. A fine this steep for being late in a municipal court was highly unusual, bordering on punitive. Beyond that, the uneven application of the judge's rules was undeniable. Marcus's experience as a federal prosecutor had taught him to recognize patterns, and what he saw here was a pattern of injustice. His pen moved swiftly across the notepad in front of him, jotting down details, the timing of his arrival, the conduct of other latecomers, and the judge's behavior. Marcus wasn't documenting this for himself alone, he was building a case for something far bigger. The session continued, but the weight of what had transpired was evident. The court clerk hesitated occasionally as she typed, her discomfort visible. An older man 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Marcus a brief but knowing glance. It was subtle. But the message was clear: you're not the only one who has noticed this. By the time Marcus's name was called again, most of the room was paying close attention. His calm and deliberate stride back to the podium contrasted with the tension that hung in the air. Judge Harris's piercing gaze followed him. But Marcus remained unfazed. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady, "I have documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and the new tax assessment reflects a 30% increase without proper explanation or notification." He placed his neatly organized folder on the podium, gesturing toward a specific page. "Here is the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. And here is the sudden adjustment, which I believe to be a clerical error." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of disinterest and irritation. "I'll review it in due time, Mr. Taylor. However, your tardiness remains an issue. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court?" Marcus took a slow breath, maintaining his composure. "Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we can all agree requires immediate attention." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason." It wasn't just the words that struck Marcus, it was the unspoken tone, the underlying dismissal of his explanation, his professional achievements, his character. Even the effort he had made to appear respectful, all of it was disregarded. Marcus let the moment settle before speaking again. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" The quiet murmur that rippled through the room was impossible to ignore. Judge Harris stiffened, his face reddening slightly. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Taylor?" "I'm asking for clarity," Marcus replied, his tone even and measured. "It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself but for everyone here." The judge's gavel came down sharply, silencing the room. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Marcus inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, he felt the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. Some looked at him with quiet admiration, while others seemed apprehensive, as if unsure whether to speak out or remain silent. Marcus had encountered bias cloaked in authority before, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room had shifted. The session eventually ended, and Marcus lingered as people filed out. He observed their faces, some tense, others relieved. A young law student in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression a mix of awe and determination. The older man who had exchanged a glance with Marcus earlier approached him briefly. "You did good, son," he said quietly, before walking out. Back in his car, Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out his badge. The embossed federal prosecutor's emblem gleamed in the sunlight. He made a quiet decision then and there: this wasn't over. What he had witnessed today wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a larger, systemic problem. And he was determined to address it. Typing notes into his phone, Marcus began drafting a report for his office. This wasn't just about a fine or a personal slight. It was about ensuring that no one, regardless of their background, was subjected to unequal treatment in a courtroom that was supposed to uphold justice. The email Marcus sent that afternoon traveled faster than he anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Julia was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, but her voice carried a tone of urgency and intrigue. "Marcus," she began, I've read your report. If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does. Marcus replied. This wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before. And I'm certain I'm not the only one who has experienced it. Julia paused. I'm reaching out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly. In the meantime, keep gathering documentation. If this goes public, we need to be ready. After the call ended, Marcus got to work. He spent hours reviewing public records, combing through case histories tied to Judge Harris. The data painted a damning picture. Black defendants were fined an average of 300% more than white defendants for the same infractions. Requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were often granted to white defendants but disproportionately denied to black defendants. Reaching out to colleagues and community members, Marcus began collecting testimonies. Lawyers who had appeared before Judge Harris shared their own accounts. Many prefaced with statements like, "I didn't think anyone would listen," or "I thought this was just how things worked." Former defendants described the humiliation and frustration they felt standing before the judge. One young woman recounted being fined $500 for a parking violation while a white man with a similar record walked away with a warning. The story began to spread beyond Marcus's immediate circle. A young law student who had been in the courtroom the day Marcus was fined posted a detailed account of the incident on social media. Her post, written with a mix of outrage and admiration for Marcus's calm defiance, quickly gained traction. Within hours, it was shared widely, sparking a flood of similar stories from others who had faced discrimination in courtrooms across the state. Local news outlets picked up the story next. With headlines like "Bias in Jacksonville Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand." Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Justice should be blind and end courtroom bias." Inside the courthouse, the pressure mounted. Investigators from the Judicial Review Commission began interviewing staff, reviewing records, and piecing together a timeline of systemic bias. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk who had hesitated during Marcus's hearing, became a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are my notes," she said quietly. "Every time I saw something that didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I didn't think anyone would ever care. But I can't stay silent anymore." Her notebook detailed dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment, corroborating much of what Marcus had observed. James Wilson, a veteran bailiff, also stepped forward, his voice steady but somber. "I've been here 15 years, he told investigators. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. It's wrong. And it's long past time for something to be done." As the evidence mounted, Judge Harris became increasingly isolated. He denied wrongdoing in public statements, calling the accusations misinterpretations of his strict courtroom policies. Privately, however, he faced closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees, where the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. The tipping point came with the release of the Judicial Review Commission's preliminary findings. The report was unequivocal. Judge Harris's actions showed a clear pattern of bias against black defendants, with fines, penalties, and judgments disproportionately harsher than those imposed on white defendants. The findings called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges and regular audits of case outcomes. Faced with the prospect of a public disciplinary hearing and mounting public outcry, Judge Harris announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional harm caused, but the words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. For Marcus, the resignation was a moment of vindication but not one of celebration. This was just the beginning. The resignation of one judge wouldn't fix the deeper, systemic issues that had allowed such bias to thrive unchecked for so long. As he stood outside the courthouse, watching protesters cheer the news of the resignation, Marcus's thoughts turned to the future. This wasn't just about holding one person accountable, it was about creating a system that ensured fairness and dignity for everyone who entered a courtroom. Back at his office that evening, Marcus opened his notebook and began drafting a list of proposals: improved oversight measures, bias training, and better avenues for defendants to report misconduct. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for the next step. In the months following Judge Harris's resignation, the ripple effects of Marcus's stand against bias began to transform Jacksonville's municipal court system. The Judicial Review Commission, emboldened by the overwhelming evidence, implemented sweeping reforms. Mandatory bias training was introduced for judges and court staff, aiming to address the subtle yet damaging prejudices that had gone unchecked for decades. Regular audits of court decisions were mandated to ensure fairness, with particular attention paid to racial and socioeconomic disparities. The courthouse itself underwent a symbolic transformation. The tired beige walls were repainted. New signs were installed to help guide visitors to resources, and pamphlets offering information on legal aid and payment plans were made readily available. A small plaque was mounted near the entrance, reading, "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courtroom, the changes were even more profound. Judge Harris's replacement was a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality. Court staff reported a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. There was less tension, fewer murmurs of frustration, and more defendants leaving with a sense of dignity intact. Marcus, however, knew that the work was far from over. The systemic bias that had thrived under Judge Harris was not unique to Jacksonville. News of the case had sparked interest in other municipalities, with activists and reporters digging into court records across the state and even beyond. The state's judicial board announced a broad review of municipal courts, vowing to root out similar patterns of discrimination. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing movement. Invitations poured in for him to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences. His story had become an inspiration, particularly for young lawyers and students from underrepresented backgrounds. At one such event, a young black law student approached him after his speech, clutching a notebook filled with ideas for judicial reforms. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Marcus smiled, humbled by her words. "The fight is just beginning," he said gently. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined judicial authority. Marcus, however, remained steadfast. The data spoke for itself. Within a year, the audits showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences in Jacksonville's municipal court. Payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect during proceedings. Beyond the courtroom, Marcus's impact was felt in the community. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had testified during the investigation, began leading bias training sessions for court officers. At one session, he addressed a room full of new hires. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he said. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose hidden notebook had been pivotal in exposing the bias, was promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She mentored younger clerks, ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. For Marcus, the most rewarding moments came from the people who shared their stories with him. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom the day Marcus was fined returned to the courthouse months later to thank him. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice. But I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said, 'Enough. Thank you for giving us hope.'" One morning, Marcus received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago. She had read about his stand against bias and had started her own investigation into disparities in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line: "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Reading the letter, Marcus felt a deep sense of responsibility. His fight wasn't just about Jacksonville or his own experience, it was about creating a ripple effect that would inspire others to challenge the systems that perpetuated inequality. Months later, Marcus returned to the courthouse where it all began. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation this time. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center named in part after his efforts. As he stood at the podium, Marcus scanned the room. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the space. Their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Justice isn't just about laws," he said. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous. But Marcus's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And he knew that while the road ahead was still long, this was a step in the right direction. Marcus stood outside the newly renovated courthouse, watching as people filed in and out. The plaque near the entrance, "Equal justice is everyone's right," gleamed in the afternoon sun, a small but powerful symbol of the change he had helped bring. This wasn't the end of his journey, but a meaningful chapter in a fight that would continue for years to come. As Marcus reflected on the progress made, he felt a deep sense of pride, not for himself, but for the countless voices that had finally been heard. He knew the fight for fairness and justice was far from over. But he also knew that each step forward mattered. Turning toward the city skyline, Marcus whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." If Marcus's story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful tales of courage, resilience, and change.